Hello, everyone. For folks joining, we'll get started in about a minute. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's event, Leveraging the Benefits of Plant-Based Proteins for Municipal Climate Action. My name is Madison Calhoun, and I'm the Senior Manager of Educational Programs here at the Environmental Law Institute. We're so excited to have you joining us this afternoon. We have a fantastic program planned for you all today. I want to take a moment to thank our wonderful speakers for taking the time to join us as well. Today's event will be recorded and posted to the ELI website and our YouTube page. So if you're unable to view the entire program, be sure to check back to the event webpage within a few business days to see the recording. You can also find all of the PowerPoint presentations that will be used today on the webpage, as well as some resources shared by our speakers. We'll post a link to that in the chat. We will be taking audience questions at the end of the program, so please feel free to put your questions in Zoom's Q&A box as soon as you think of them. There's no need to wait until the end of the program. While the chat will also be open for you to post your observations throughout the program, please put any questions that you wish for our speakers to address in the Q&A box, not the chat. I'll now go ahead and introduce each of our speakers before turning the program over to today's moderator. We'll be introducing the speakers with a shortened version of their biographies, but you can find the links to their full biographies on the event webpage. First, we have our moderator, Linda Bregan. Linda is a senior attorney and the director of the Center for State and Local Governance here at ELI. She's managed a wide range of environmental law and policy projects with us for over 20 years. She's also a senior strategic advisor to the Nashville Food Waste Initiative. Linda previously served as an associate director in the White House Office on Environmental Policy, counsel to a congressional subcommittee, a special assistant in the Office of Enforcement at the US EPA, and counsel to a large New York-based law firm. We also have Sarah Backer speaking today, who is a research associate at ELI. She's currently working on ELI's municipal climate change and waste reduction work, including ELI's food waste initiative to spearhead key research, work with stakeholders, and draft policy tools for cities to achieve climate and waste goals. Sarah's also the host of the People, Places, Planet podcast and the managing editor of ELI's Vibrant Environment blog. Speaking next today will be Katrina Wyman. Katrina is the Wolf Family Professor of Property Law at New York University School of Law, where she teaches and researches in the areas of property, urban environmental law, and natural resources law, among other subjects. Katrina is co-faculty director of NYU Law's Center on Environmental, Energy, and Land Use Law, and faculty director of the law school's LLM program in Environment and Energy Law. Her recent research has addressed a range of topics, including the role of cities in environmental law in the US and abroad, and the development of novel forms of property. We also have Sierra Hollowell joining us today. At the New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy, Sierra conducts research and data analysis, supports the implementation of the food education roadmap, generates climate-related policy briefings, and monitors legislative affairs relating to New York City food policy. She earned her bachelor's degree in economics and political science from Columbia University, where she served as the president of Columbia Vegan Society, as well as the director of alternative proteins at Columbia Effective Altruism. And last but not least, we have Celia Burke, who's the Equity Practice Manager at Urban Sustainability Directors Network. She's been at USDN for over 4 years and has been in the role of Equity Practice Manager for over 2 years. In her role, she creates, facilitates, and manages equity educational programming and affinity spaces for people of color within USDN's network of local government sustainability professionals. She's based in New Orleans, Louisiana. Thank you again so much to all of our speakers for preparing great content for today's program. Now I'll go ahead and turn things over to Linda to get us started. Thank you all so much for being here.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you, Madison, and thank you to Sarah Viken as well for organizing this webinar. We are really excited to introduce you to our new toolkit for incorporating plant-based protein measures in municipal climate action plans. And our plan for today is to start with some background information and an overview of the toolkit. And then we're going to hear from each of our wonderful guests for about 10 minutes. And then we're going to go to questions. As Madison said, please use the question box for your questions, and you don't need to wait until the end. So I want to just start with a very big picture observation that as a general matter, we're seeing more and more discipline. And oh, I guess you can switch the slide. Sorry, I forgot I'm supposed to cue you just to our first landing slide. So big picture here, as a general matter, we're seeing more and more disciplines coming together in the environmental law and policy arena. So no longer is environmental policy separate and distinct from energy law, for example, or for today's purposes, it's not separate from equity or public health or even animal law. There's just so much overlap and so many synergies. And that's why an environmental organization like the Environmental Law Institute ended up putting together a climate action plan toolkit on plant-based proteins, which I really don't think we would have seen, a decade ago. If you go to the first slide, I want to start with some background before we jump into the toolkit details. So first, some background on climate action plans, or CAPs, as we call them. Why did we focus on CAPs? Well, the toolkit focuses on climate action plans because they're often a starting point for a city that wants to mitigate or adapt to climate change. They provide a roadmap, essentially. And I do want to emphasize, when I say city, I mean really any type of local government. So it could be a small town, it could be a county, for example. But cities and other local governments are really on the front lines for dealing with climate change. I mean, not only do they have outside carbon footprints themselves, but they're dealing in real time already, with the impacts of climate change, from flooding to extreme heat. And of course, that's only going to get worse. So the role of cities is even more, all the more important, because we have gridlock at the federal level in Congress in terms of regulating greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, Congress finally did act in the form of subsidies, which is great, but it isn't the same as actually requiring the reduction of emissions. And these subsidies have shifted the focus even more to local governments as the place to solve climate problems. But even before the Inflation Reduction Act, cities recognized their important role in addressing climate change. 35 of the 50 largest cities in the US had caps as of 2022, and then many mid-sized and small cities as well. Over 13,000 cities worldwide are part of the Global Covenant for Climate and Energy. It's a voluntary initiative to reduce emissions. It's really important to keep in mind, as we talk about this toolkit today, that CAP development processes, the content of CAPs, the format of CAPs varies widely from city to city. And if we go to the next slide, however, there are some commonalities, particularly for the cities that are part of GCOM, of the Global Covenant, because that requires certain steps and content in your CAPs if you're participating. But cities will typically start with a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and most use the same global protocol for community scale greenhouse gas inventories. They then develop mitigation targets and adaptation goals, and then they identify the actions to take to achieve their targets and goals. And here's a little spoiler alert. Our research indicated that most do not include plant-based protein actions. If you go to the next slide, this slide is about the type of emissions that are counted or reported under the global protocol that most cities use. And there's going to be more on that. So we're going to move on from Professor Wyman in just a few minutes. So if you go to the next slide, that's why we focused on climate action plans. Let's turn to why we focused on plant-based proteins. So it's estimated that food accounts for over a quarter on average of a city's consumption-based emissions. And for protein foods, plant-based proteins have a comparatively lower carbon footprint per gram of protein. And not only can cities leverage plant-based proteins for climate action, but as Sarah's going to talk about in a minute, there's a whole range of other benefits or co-benefits that come with actions to address plant-based proteins. So because our research showed that very few climate action plans include plant-based protein actions, we wanted to fill that gap with this toolkit. Many local governments are understaffed, they're under-resourced, particularly in smaller and mid-sized cities. So we're hoping that this toolkit will help make it easier for them to include CAP actions. Now, we're specifically focused on two types of actions, right? Actions to increase the availability of plant-based proteins and actions to engage the public on their benefits. So note, we aren't focused on the consumption of plant-based proteins per se. The actions help make them available and to engage the public on their myriad benefits, but the actions are not trying to dictate diets. The actions provide for information and options and more choices, basically. And I want to emphasize again that the toolkit is for all types of cities, right? What one city can do, another may not be able to for a variety of reasons, whether it's stakeholder interest or budget constraints. So we hope that there's something in this toolkit for every local government, whatever its situation. And with that, I want to hand it over to Sarah to show you what's in the toolkit.
Thanks, Linda. So our toolkit consists of two parts. The first part is the menu of plant-based protein actions. So this is a long list of over 40 actions that a city can incorporate into its climate action plan. And these actions range from ambitious to incremental, as we will see later. And then the second part is an outline of key considerations. So this includes climate benefits and the co-benefits associated with plant-based protein actions, as well as challenges and legal and policy considerations. So for the toolkit, we researched sustainable food-related actions in municipal climate action plans and sustainability plans from 36 geographically and size-diverse U.S. cities, and we identified best practices and gaps. And I really want to stress, like Linda did, that we wanted to include measures that would be feasible for any city to take, that being small or big-sized cities in all parts of the country. So we identified examples in different existing plans, and we provided links to those examples, and we also created novel actions. Then we conducted interviews and vetted drafts with experts, and these experts included some people on the call today, also legal experts, municipal staff, sustainability experts, and plant-based protein advocacy groups. So as Linda was saying, municipalities can tailor the example actions to their specific context, depending on stakeholder priorities and available resources. So our menu, so this long list of example actions, consists right now and consists of 7 categories in total. So the first category is about establishing food-related greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and measuring all the progress. The second is about increasing the number of meals served that contain plant-based proteins. The third is about increasing the procurement of plant-based proteins. The fourth is education and engaging the public on these actions. The fifth is recognizing and rewarding businesses and organizations that are leaders in this space. The sixth is funding incentives and technical assistance. So supporting businesses and organizations that are seeking to expand plant-based protein offerings and facilitate access to plant-based proteins, especially in communities that lack adequate access. So this is especially in communities that are low-income communities and communities of color. And then the seventh is endorsing different plant-based protein actions at the international, state, and federal levels. It's going to go to full screen because for some reason it went off. So to help visualize exactly how this will look like in our toolkit, this is a sample menu page from our toolkit. And this is the second category of action, increased availability. So these are actions, as I said before, to increase the number of meals served or offered that contain plant-based proteins. So this, in the first action of this category, is to institute weekly menu initiatives. So for instance, a Veggie Tuesday for municipal operations, and also to encourage institutions and entities that may not be subject to municipal authority or that are not fully subject to municipal authority to institute their own. And Linda will talk about this distinction shortly. And as you can see, we include many different examples from cities. So these are links to their climate action plans or just links to where they have, how they have already implemented these actions. And what we found was that it is really important for cities to learn from other cities and see what they are doing. And they might want to reach out to other cities. And it's also really important to provide examples from cities that are geographically similar or similar in size. Then we also have resources, and these are any educational materials that will help the toolkit user understand what the action is. And then we have outreach tools when available. So these are really public-facing tools. They're very hands-on. They're either promotional videos, social media posts, menus, recipes, and the like. And so now for a brief survey of the second part of the toolkit, we're going to talk about climate benefits, co-benefits, challenges, and legal and policy considerations. So as Linda was saying before, plant-based proteins offer significant climate benefits. Producing the average US resident's diet is estimated to generate 2.5 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent annually. Most plant-based proteins have a comparatively small carbon footprint because plants require less in the way of resources and energy to grow, harvest, and distribute. And plant-based protein actions can be adopted incrementally with small behavioral changes. So now we're going to discuss the different co-benefits of plant-based protein actions. So one of the co-benefits is expanded food options for different dietary requirements. There's also a smaller environmental impact associated with plant-based proteins due to reduced water footprint and water and air pollution. And plant-based proteins offer significant health co-benefits. Research shows that Americans do not eat a healthy diet, and that diet is the leading cause of premature death in the United States. And this is partially due to insufficient intake of fruits and vegetables. According to the Federal Dietary Guidelines for Americans, a healthy diet can be achieved by incorporating plant protein, which is part of the expansive protein food group. But a majority of Americans have diets low in vegetables and fruits, as I've already said, and most do not satisfy the recommendation for plant-based protein intake. Specifically, more than half of Americans do not meet the recommendation for nuts, seeds, and soy products. As a result, shifts are needed within the protein foods group to add variety to subgroup intakes. Selecting from the beans, peas, and lentils subgroup more often could help Americans better meet recommendations while also ensuring adequate protein consumption. And finally, plant-based proteins offer municipalities and others with an opportunity to increase meaningful community involvement and food access for all, and also provides expanded options for those who are concerned with farm animal welfare. And now let's turn on to Linda for the challenges and legal and policy considerations.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. And as you can see, there really are a lot of benefits and co-benefits as well. So I want to talk briefly about some of the challenges related to incorporating plant-based proteins into CAPs. I'm going to move fairly quickly because we're running a little bit behind schedule. I want to start with, to me, what's the most interesting, which is behavior change. It will surprise no one that researchers find that human behavior is complicated, right? We know this from our daily lives with our coworkers, family, and friends. But in developing plant-based protein actions and really all environmental work, it behooves us to look to the scientific literature about what is known about drivers of behavior change. And that's from a range of disciplines from behavioral economics to social psychology. The Behavioral Insights team, I have a little note there on the slide, has a menu for change that does a really nice job of summarizing lessons from the literature and boiling it down to some really simple propositions like make it normal, right? So actions should normalize or make mainstream eating plant-based proteins rather than treating plant-based proteins as an alternative to the norm. Do this through actions, for example, of regular plant-based protein menu items. Other lessons are even more straightforward, things like make it appealing. Another is make it easy and convenient. Another really important point to highlight is that research indicates that information and awareness campaigns alone may have limited effects on behavior change, can raise support for a given policy, but not so much behavior change. So in selecting CAP actions, it may make sense to combine outreach on plant-based proteins with complementary strategies, such as measures that increase their availability. I also just want to quickly mention spillover effects. That should be a factor in considering what cap actions to include. And these can be negative or positive spillover effects, right? So this goes to the behavior is complicated point. If you eat a plant-based protein meal at work because it's on the menu, maybe you're more likely to make a plant-based recipe at home, or you also might instead have a double serving of a non-plant-based protein to balance it out. But you get the idea. It's complicated. There's just so much more that policymakers can learn from social scientists about the drivers of behavior change, but I'll leave it at that for now. I want to make a few quick points about cost and greenhouse gas emissions estimates. And this really applies to all climate action plan actions. We know this because we have a companion toolkit on incorporating food waste reduction measures in climate action plans. Because the scale of implementation of any action can vary greatly from city to city, it's really hard to place any estimate in the toolkit attached to a particular action with respect to cost or emissions reduction. But that clearly is the best practice to assign those values in a cap so you can figure out if you have an adequate budget for what you want to do and whether your actions are going to add up to your emissions reduction target. Again, not unique to plant-based proteins, but I wanted to flag it that we don't provide those estimates. For costs, I also want to note that in incorporating plant-based actions into a climate action plan, it's worth knowing there are some really good case studies out there that indicate cities can save money through such actions. I think I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead given time, but I do want to, just note that there's quite a bit of state and federal funding out there for localities to address climate change. So that's, part of the picture as well. If we go to the last slide, I want to close with a quick snapshot of some of the relevant legal considerations. Because we are the Environmental Law Institute, I really have to mention some law here. But most of the issues we flag in the toolkit are really an exercise in issue spotting for someone who wants the big picture legal landscape. For purposes of actually using the toolkit, however, the part that is probably the most relevant is that the toolkit does not specify which governance tools to use to implement the cap actions, if in fact one is needed. And this is because often several tools could be used: executive orders, policies, procurement regulations, ordinances, for example. It's really up to the municipality to decide, and the tools can vary from municipality to municipality, including just what they call the tool. Another more practical issue that may come up, as Sarah mentioned earlier, is that with some actions, you're calling on what we refer to as semi-autonomous entities, right? These are entities that are not necessarily subject to the central control of the municipality. So think about schools, for example, which typically might have their own governing board, right? So you would have to work with that entity to get support for a cap action. A mayor or might not just be able to say, you have to do this. So there are other issues we discuss in the toolkit related to the scope of municipal authority vis-a-vis the state to adopt certain actions, as well as some other jurisdictional issues. Again, we flag these issues in the toolkit, but in my experience, local staff, government staff are well aware of the issues around their jurisdiction and their authority. If they aren't sure, they just consult with the municipal law office. So enough on the law part. I am going to hand it over to Professor Wyman. Thanks for listening.
Great. Okay, so thank you so much, Linda. And I just really want to start by thanking the ELI for putting together this really wonderful toolkit, and it's making a huge contribution. Okay, so I've been asked to talk about the first category of ideas in the toolkit. Those are the ideas for tracking greenhouse gas emissions from food and establishing targets for reducing GHG emissions from food. And really what I'm going to focus on is two ideas for tracking emissions from food, which is a predicate to establishing targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from food. Okay, so the first idea I'm going to talk about is the idea of tracking emissions from city government purchases of food. And the second idea is the more ambitious idea of estimating citywide emissions from food. Now, even though I'm going to be talking about, ideas for tracking or estimating emissions from food, I do think it's important to emphasize at the outset that you can include ideas in a climate action program or plan, for increasing access to plant-based proteins without tracking your emissions from food. In other words, you don't have to make the perfect the enemy of the good. Okay, so with that, let me start with kind of the simpler sort of idea, I think. The idea that a local government could track the emissions from city government purchases of food. So probably many people on this Zoom are familiar with kind of some of the history of climate action planning at the local level. And I would say initially when local governments started to get interested in addressing climate change, they often focused on their own operations, their own city government operations first. And so this idea is sort of in that vein, bearing in mind the idea of looking at food as part of a climate action program is relatively new. So it makes sense to maybe start by trying to track the emissions from the food that the local government itself is purchasing. Okay, so which it could be purchasing for meetings, it could be purchasing for facilities that are operated by the local governments, like jails, for example, depends on the authority of the local government. So how does the local government track emissions from food that it purchases? This could sound extremely daunting because that purchasing can be very decentralized. But what you can try to do is basically estimate the amount of money that the government is spending on food, in particular by category, so meat and dairy products, for example, fruit and vegetable products could be another category. Or you could try to estimate the volume that it's purchasing of certain kinds of food, okay? Now, again, you don't have to make the perfect the enemy of the good here. You could just focus on certain categories, for example, initially. Or you could focus on trying to estimate the volume of these different categories from certain agencies at the outset, okay? Then once you have some kind of estimate like this, okay, for a time period, then there actually are data sets available that allow you to attach to these estimates based on spending or volume, GHG emissions for different categories of food, okay? Now, all of this may sound very daunting. There's an even simpler thing that you can do, okay, which is that you can, rather than doing yourself, the reason I'm showing this slide is because you can actually rely on a kind of calculator or that's produced by an external authority. So for example, the World Resources Institute, an environmental NGO well known probably to many local government people involved in sustainability, has a cool food pledge where if you pledge to reduce your emissions, you sort of an organizational entity by 25% by 2030, then they will have you report annually, you know, the volume of food that you're purchasing by category, and then they'll use their cool food calculator to figure out the emissions from those food purchases. And they'll turn that over to you. And I think Sierra is going to talk in a few minutes about how New York City has basically gotten data from the Cool Food Calculator and now has a kind of dashboard for reporting its emissions from its food purchases. Okay, so now I'm going to briefly go into the second big idea, the more ambitious idea. So the more ambitious idea is to do a community-wide inventory of emissions from things that are consumed within the community, okay? So many people are probably familiar with the traditional GHG inventory that Linda was mentioning earlier, which is on the left here for San Francisco, where generally speaking, you would have three categories of emissions from three categories: buildings or stationary energy, transportation, and waste. What's on the right here is a consumption-based inventory, okay? And what a consumption-based inventory does is it basically reports the emissions from all the things that are consumed within the jurisdiction, okay? So the sectoral-based inventory, the one on the left, is reporting emissions from activities that are occurring within the locality's borders and electricity that's imported into the locality. The consumption-based inventory is reporting from the life cycle emissions of all of the things consumed within the jurisdiction. And it's in this kind of inventory that food shows up, okay? But again, this is food emissions for the whole community, not just for the city government. And the other thing to keep in mind about the consumption-based inventory here is that this is based on estimates. Okay, so this basically, the way these inventories are typically done is that people get estimates of national spending on these different categories of goods. And then they get usually national level averages of emissions associated with the life cycle of these different categories of goods. Okay, so it's not anybody's going around surveying in any particular location, you know, how many clothes are being bought, say, in Nashville or anything, and then estimating the emissions from that volume of clothes. This is based on estimates based on national level spending data and national level emissions usually. But this does provide a way of highlighting the significance of food as a source of emissions. So I'll just conclude with one other slide here, which is this is a third slide where I'm showing you here a new technique, okay, so this would actually be a third idea, I guess, where basically what New York City did is they combined the traditional sector-based inventory, and then they combined an inventory of household consumption-based emissions, okay? And what you can see, I won't go into all the details, this is in their 2023 Plan YC. What you can see here is that when you combine emissions from these two sources, these two inventories, and then you account for the overlap. In New York City, when they did this in 2023, food emerged as the third largest source of emissions. So buildings was still number one as under the traditional sectoral inventory, transportation number two, but food number three. Okay, so this is a third variation, which again highlights the significance of food emissions. And once you know the significance, then you can start to think about policies to maybe reduce those emissions. So I'm now going to turn it over to Sierra.
Yeah, that's a great segue. And I just want to what's happening in New York. And I just want to remind everyone to put your questions in the Q&A box. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katrina. I will start my slides in a second. Am I able to go back to the first slide? Thank you so much. All right. Yes. Thank you, Katrina. I think that's an excellent segue into New York City's plant-powered initiatives and our climate goals. Again, my name is Sierra. I'm a policy analyst at the New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy. Started not too long ago. My portfolio includes intergovernmental affairs, food education, and climate. So super excited to dive in. Just for some context, last April, the mayor made an announcement and he essentially pledged to reduce the city's food-related emissions by 33% by 2030. And this was the first time we ever made a commitment like this in regards to food emissions. And this applies to all city agencies that serve food. So kind of what Katrina made the distinction between city agencies reducing their emissions and then an overall like New York City or city framework. This is just focused on city agencies. So hospitals, schools, correctional facilities, homeless shelters, older adult centers, those are the largest buyers of food in the city. We also launched the Plant-Powered Carbon Challenge, which really challenges the private sector to likewise take a step in this direction and reduce their emissions by 25% by the same time frame. And so here you can see this is a picture of our dashboard on our website. I can link it in the chat later. I think it's a really fun tool. But thankfully, you know, we're already tracking this information. So this is on our transparency tab on the website, and it shows our food purchases by weight across various food categories. So, you know, we have dairy, fruits and vegetables, along with many others. And you can filter through fiscal year and by agency. It goes back until 2019. And so you can see how that's evolved over time. We also have an environmental sustainability tab. So you can see that pictured here. And it shows the associated emissions across the food groups. You can also see the GHG emissions per meal and then total. And there are also other tabs on the dashboard that show information about local economies, nutrition, and animal welfare, but we'll stick with the environmental sustainability for the purpose of this presentation. And so just getting a closer look into the data, this is our fiscal year 2022 data. To our left, we have information on the weight of various foods procured, as well as to our right, the GHG emissions. And we can see like some trends that I think we also saw in our inventory of the household consumption inventory for New York City. You know, food is a large emitter, but then there are also certain food groups that are emitting more than others. We're seeing, for example, that animal source proteins and dairy are contributing the vast majority of emissions, despite only being 50% of food procured. And when we look at calorie information, this difference is even starker. So we're seeing only 38% of calories being contributed by these groups, yet still that 80% contribution towards emissions. And to me, you know, this is a real opportunity, I think, to incorporate this in our climate action plans by replacing these higher emitting foods with lower emitting plant foods. And so for the rest of the presentation, I'll touch on some of our plant-powered initiatives in New York City that really do the switch and putting plants at the center of the plate. So first, I'll start with our schools. Very exciting. So this is a menu from January of this year. In 2019, we instituted Meatless Mondays. So that's for every Monday. We also have our Plant-Powered Fridays, which centers the main option as plant-based. And so here, for example, we have the white bean and pasta primavera, the zesty chickpea stew. And then throughout the week, we also have some other plant-powered options, you know, just scattered throughout the week. But this has been very successful and a really, I think, easy and, you know, first step in transitioning towards more plant-forward procurement. But of course, as Linda mentioned, each city is different and, you know, they have different capacities in, I guess, influencing what a school might be serving. So like in this case, Mayor Adams could sign an executive order and make this happen, but that could be different across various different cities. We also have our hospitals. So we have our plant-based default program that started 2 years ago. And this essentially just made the default plant-based, but patients could still opt in for the animal-based option. So choice was preserved. But in doing this, we saw a huge reduction in our food-related emissions for hospitals. So we saw a 36% decrease in our food-related emissions. We also saved 59 cents per plant-based meal. And we've served over 1.2 million plant-based meals since March 2022. Pre-program, about only 1% of patients opted for the plant-based option, but now we have about 50 to 60% of patients sticking with the plant-based option, with the remaining opting for the animal-based option. So you're seeing a 1% to a 50, 60% change. And that's all by just calling the plant-based option the chef's special. You know, nothing crazy here. Patients can still opt for the options they were choosing before, but it's just a simple change in language, and we're seeing these quite stark differences. We also have our New York City food standards. And so, you know, I just touched on 2 areas where we've seen, I think, a lot of progress, but then throughout our agencies, you know, the correctional facilities, the homeless shelters and others, they also have these food standards applied to them, which essentially they're revised every 3 years, and they set various requirements for different foods procured, including this last revisions included a plant protein minimum weekly. So it was the first time that we're now requiring that at least 1 meal per meal type in the week features a plant protein and it's on the plate. So it doesn't have to be exclusively plant-based, but just that the protein on the plate is plant-based. And so we also are phasing out processed meats by 2025 and set limitations for how many servings of beef could be served per week. And these standards not only evolve with, you know, evolving nutrition science, but more information on what is good for planetary health, which I think we're all interested on this call about. Now, I've talked about increasing the availability of these plant-powered options in various institutions. But I think it's also very important that we pair this with education. So students or, you know, New Yorkers alike, whoever is being served by these agencies have the knowledge and are empowered to choose these options because, you know, the choice is still there. They can pick the more plant forward option or not, but we think it's really important that we highlight the benefits from a nutrition perspective, from a climate perspective, to really empower people to choose these options. So to our left, we have our Eat a Whole Lot More Plants campaign by the Department of Health. They launched this last May, and it just encourages New Yorkers broadly to increase their consumption of more plant forward ingredients, and to also like minimally processed ingredients. We also released our food education roadmap last June. That's to our right, prioritizing food education in our public schools. And this really seeks to increase food education and create a culture of healthy eating and wellness across schools across New York City. So in the last year, we've been increasing professional development opportunities for teachers, getting more food education programming into schools. So it's not just that, you know, their cafeteria is suddenly changing and they're seeing these options and they're like, okay, you know, that's great, but why is this changing? Why is this important? Why do we care about this? You know, how is this connected to our climate and to justice and to health? It's quite an expansive view of education, food education. Just wary of time, but we also, I'll just quickly touch on taste. So we have the availability aspect, we have the education, but we also want the meals to taste good. And so here I've just included some ways that New York City has really been focused on recently and trying to make these meals tastier. One is through recipe development. So we partnered with an organization called Wellness in the Schools, and they developed about over 100 plant-based scratch-cooked meals, different recipes, and students were given the opportunity to taste test all of these meals. And a recipe could not be featured on the menu on New York City Public Schools menu unless it reached a 70% approval rating by students. So this is really trying to ensure that, you know, those who are eating these meals, you know, are excited about them and like them. We've also been really focused on culinary training, so that these recipes translate well onto the plate. You know, of course, these sorts of recipes might not be, you know, accustomed, or more so that culinary staff might not be accustomed to making these recipes, like more plant forward recipes. And so currently all New York City schools in the next 2 years will be trained to cook these recipes, specifically scratch cooked and plant-based recipes, but also we're investing training for our correctional facilities for plant-based culinary training this upcoming fall, specifically in Rikers, to hopefully make them more delicious and have I guess increase the uptake of these recipes. So that is all from me. I'm happy to take any questions later on, and we can pass it on to Celia.
Celia, yeah, you're up, and you have some wonderful questions that have been really helpful to me in my work, not just on plant-based proteins. So over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Again, my name is Celia Burke, and I'm the Equity Practice Manager at USDN. If you wouldn't mind going back to the first slide, that would be great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk about incorporating a racial equity toolkit. And this is important because it provides a structure for processes to advance racial equity, both within your offices and within your communities. And it's really important in when you are considering cultural context, especially when working to implement new policies, like food-based ones, like this plant-based protein municipal plan toolkit is offering guidelines on. It's really important to incorporate racial equity and to think about cultural context. And USDN has been offering an introductory course on equity since 2015 called Equity Foundations to our network, which are local government practitioners, mainly in sustainability. We updated the course in 2022, and we have 2 cohorts per year who do live racial caucus sessions with each cohort. And the link to our Equity Foundations 1.0 is public, and we're going to be sharing that. But one thing that's consistent in both versions of this course is a need for a racial equity tool that incorporates certain elements, but is ultimately tailored for your municipal experience or environment. And so if we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So some of the questions that we would maybe want to explore are, do you have a clear community outcome for racial equity? And so this is not something that only your team can decide in your office. It's really important to identify the desired outcome for community members. And it's really impossible to fully understand that without having key conversations. And so how do you ensure that those conversations are happening? Is there a precedent for town halls, surveying, calls? How do you reach out to your community and communicate with them and get a clear understanding of what their needs are so that you can have a really clear community outcome for racial equity? Another question that you might want to ask yourself is, what does your analysis of community data tell you? And so recognizing that quantitative data can be a really powerful tool, is a very powerful tool, but doesn't always tell the full story. How are you uplifting and collecting that qualitative data, like narratives from community members as well? I would also say one of the conversations that's coming up a lot in equity spaces is language justice. And that's not only about being able to offer translation services for non-English speakers, but it's also being able to fully understand different cultural contexts that kind of live within the language, within the culture, and being able to really connect with your community members or non-English speaking community members in a way that makes sense to them. And this is really important, especially when we're talking about food and other things like that. Another question is, how have communities been engaged? Are there opportunities to expand engagement? So this is really an opportunity for you to be honest with yourselves and do some internal examination of what community engagement has looked like on your end. And so again, has there been town hall meetings? Has there been surveying? Has there been really any real engagement happening at all? And ask your community members how they've perceived your community engagement and what they think needs to improve as well. So that internal investigation is really important. We can always do some reflection to do some self-improvement, but it's also really important to give space for feedback from community members and adjust accordingly based on the things that they're sharing with you in terms of what they need from the city, from the county, from their government. The next question is, who will benefit from or be burdened by your proposal? And what strategies will advance racial equity? This is really important. Even if you believe that your proposal will benefit everyone again, I think that something like plant-based protein is really beneficial for a lot of different people, for health reasons and for the environment. But it's really best to ask those community members who have been the most marginalized about what it is that they need to feel like they're being addressed in a way that feels appropriate and acknowledges past harms. So if you're really trying to ensure that the voices of your community members are heard and their feedback is integrated in your work, consistent communication and checking in are needed. And so that requires a plan of action to maintain communication on an ongoing basis. Next is, what is your plan for equity-focused implementation? This not only means initiating or launching the proposal, your community or your climate action plan, for example, but also establishing a plan that keeps you accountable and checking in frequently to ensure that you're honoring your equity commitments. So it's really important to have a framework of feedback and internal examination and external kind of examination. And so it's really important to make sure that you're making frequent touch points with your community to ensure that the implementation is successful and that the impact is long-term. And so it's not really possible to do that without regular check-ins with the community, and not kind of releasing that project out into the world without really following up and being and showing that you care about the way that this is impacting your community. And last but not least, how will you ensure accountability for and communicate about equity results? So has your team planned continued communications with community members, internal and external evaluations, ongoing equity trainings, data collection processes, etc.? This is a lot of hard work. It's really hard to maintain the momentum of this kind of work without the without really being able to check in and being present with your community. It's so easy to release a project once it's been launched, but a responsible and equitable process requires constant touch points. So that's all I have to share with you today. I'm also, another resource that's going to be shared with you is the Community Climate Action Plan for Community Recovery from San Luis Obispo, who put out a storytelling-based climate action plan back in 2020, and it's a really great example of community engagement and action. So thank you so much for having me here, and I'll pass it on to our moderators.
Well, thank you so much. And, again, I find those questions incredibly helpful, not only for thinking about the climate action toolkit on plant-based proteins, but, for all of the work that we do in the environmental realm. So thank you for that. So we have quite a few good questions. I want to remind everyone the recording is going to be available. The slides are going to be available. I also want to note that the actual toolkit we're talking about today will be available later today. We'll send the link around to all of you who registered for this webinar. So let's jump to some questions. And I think what I'll do is I'll pose the question, I'll maybe put my 2 cents in, and then open up to any of the panelists who would like to contribute. So the first question is about whether the toolkit can be followed by public schools, noting that this might help the new generation start with the right habits, and also what about universities? So this came up a little bit in our discussion. As we talked about, in many jurisdictions, schools are what we call semi-autonomous. In other words, the mayor or the council can't just tell them what to do. New York is a little bit different. So it's gonna vary. But, if you take where I live, for example, in Nashville, we have an elected school board, we have a superintendent of schools who has, a whole administrative apparatus. And then, of course, our mayor and council are involved in the budget, right? So there are a lot of players, and it's just going to depend on where you are, sort of who you need to coordinate with on this. But we do consider it incredibly important. It's mentioned in the toolkit quite a bit. But it can in some cases be a little bit more complicated. And, when it comes to nutrition, you also may have federal standards and state standards kicking in as well, making it even a little more complicated. We did a toolkit actually on share tables in schools, and it outlines some of these governance issues that you might have to navigate depending on where you're located. So I don't know if anyone else wants to say something about that.
I just want to jump in and say, first, I'm going to put the Share Tables link in the chat, Share Tables Toolkit that Linda mentioned, and also that our menu has a lot of resources that are about schools, though, just like different hands-on resources from New York City about how to advance plant-based proteins in schools. So if that is something that your municipality is interested in doing and the specific context, there are some resources there that could be helpful to you.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? And the question about universities, again, it's not simple because it depends. Is it a private university or is it a public university? We have done initiatives here on food waste reduction, for example, with Vanderbilt, which is a private entity where, the mayor's just done a collaborative initiative, voluntary initiative, but it's been extremely effective. When you start dealing with a public university, it's going to get a little bit more complicated in terms of, again, state regulations and governance issues. But absolutely, I think, universities very, very important players in all of this. All right, we'll go to another question. The question is, can you discuss what municipalities can do in states with procurement laws that require purchasing from the lowest responsible bidder? So procurement law is very complicated. I will say that this trend of what they call value-based procurement, sometimes referred to as collateral policies. This is happening all the time. It's definitely a trend. I think the question about a state requirement on lowest responsible bidder is complicated because it is going to vary state by state. That's one of the joys of working in this local government space, because there's so much variation. It's very hard to characterize and make generalities. My understanding is that there often can be a fair amount of flexibility with respect to what goes into an actual solicitation document, and whether you could, squeeze some things in there about how you frame it, to still consider, for example, plant-based proteins. Some of that will depend also on the state and whether it's a Dillon, what we call Dillon rule state, where the municipality is very limited in how much flexibility it has to act independently versus a home rule state, and also sort of just the politics of it in terms of whether the state really cares a lot and will provide that flexibility or not. So I mean, obviously in red states with blue cities, this could absolutely be a challenge. There are some wonderful resources on procurement that are also in the toolkit. And of course, there's also some, just great procurement, sustainable procurement codes out there, that you could try to work with the state on getting adopted. Does anyone else want to add on procurement?
I will quickly add, and we can follow up if, there are more questions about this. New York City is supporting the Good Food Purchase. We have our Good Food Purchasing program that has values-based procurement. But I think we can accomplish a lot even within the lowest price bidder framework, just by I suppose we don't need to consider other factors beyond price if we just menu differently. So, a lot of our agencies have to go by the lowest price, but we can choose to buy fruits and vegetables or plant source proteins instead. But I know it's difficult in the meantime. But I think also, yeah, looking into legislation like the Good Food New York bill is something that we're looking at to try to change those laws, and maybe other states would have similar legislation.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. I think we can squeeze in one more question, which was about how the federal government spends a lot of money on SNAP and other nutritional assistance programs, and basically, why not lobby Congress to adjust the rules and allow for nonprofit kitchens who source local food to accept these vouchers, because that would have a lot of benefits. We do mention we do have references to SNAP in the toolkit, and again, really good resource on that from the Vegetarian Resource Group. My understanding is there may be some opportunities to work within SNAP, but yes, we're not going to cover the question here of whether to lobby Congress, but I'm glad you put it out there. Anyone else want to comment on federal nutrition programs and how they come into play here? Right. Well, I also do want to give anyone a chance who wants to jump in with any last comments or observations before we wrap up. And if not, I'm going to just thank our wonderful panelists. I think this is such an exciting area, and I'm going to hand it over, I think, to Madison to wrap up.
Thank you so much to all of our fantastic speakers for joining us today. Thank you to Linda for moderating, as well as thank you to Sarah, Katrina, Sierra, and Celia for speaking. We so appreciate all of you taking the time and energy to make this program happen and to share such wonderful resources with our audience. Thank you as well to our audience for your time and engagement today. We so appreciate all of your questions. If you missed any part of today's webinar, the recording will be available both on the event webpage and ELI's YouTube page within a few business days. To find out more about ELI membership and other ELI programming, we encourage you to check out eli.org. We posted a lot of links in the chat as well, so feel free to check those out. And with that, I will bring today's webinar to a close. Thank you again, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Congratulations. It's a really great toolkit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.